Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a time when hair wasn't just something to wash, curl, or fuss over in front of a mirror. It was a treasure. Picture this. You're strolling along the cobblestone streets of Victorian England, your boots clicking softly as carriages rumble past. A gentle fog clings to your coat, and somewhere nearby, the chiming of a clock tower reminds you that time is always slipping away. The women you pass aren't just tucking locks behind their ears. They're carefully collecting strands of hair from their closest friends, their family, sometimes even from people they've only just met. And you're about to walk straight into this world where snipping a lock isn't weird. It's a gesture more intimate than a handshake, more binding than a photograph. Now, quick heads up, you probably won't survive this particular historical trend. Not because it's dangerous, unless you count the emotional whiplash of realizing just how much Victorians love sentimentality. But because if someone today asked to cut off a piece of your hair, you'd probably back away slowly and call security. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge further down the street, and soon find yourself peeking into drawing rooms where ladies are carefully storing locks of hair in tiny velvet pouches, slipping them into diaries, or weaving them into intricate shapes pressed carefully into brooches. It's not strange to them. It's a sign of affection. Hair doesn't fade like ink. It doesn't crumble like pressed flowers, and it doesn't just disappear. It endures. It carries the weight of presence long after the person is gone. Victorians lived in a time obsessed with memory. Photographs were a luxury, and sometimes they didn't capture the softness of a moment. A strand of hair did. It curled the way someone's smile did. It shimmered with the color of their laughter. And unlike a pressed flower, it didn't brown or wilt. In fact, hair, you realize, is almost immortal. Left untouched, it can last for hundreds of years. Suddenly, that velvet pouch in your hand feels heavier. Historians still argue whether this fascination with hair truly blossomed from raw sentiment or whether it became fashionable because it was a socially acceptable way for women to express deep, sometimes unspeakable emotions in a tightly corseted society. Some claim it was an innocent form of affection. Others whisper that these exchanges of hair were loaded with coded messages, unspoken promises, and subtle power plays. You pass by a pair of women seated side by side, each carefully cutting a small lock from the other's hair. There's no embarrassment, no hesitation. They exchange the locks as easily as you might exchange a phone number. And in that small transaction, they're binding their friendship in a way that transcends time. In a society that restricted what women could publicly say, gift, or even feel, a token of hair became a quiet but thunderous declaration. One woman holds up a locket and opens it to reveal the delicate swirl of her friend's hair inside. She presses it to her lips, smiles faintly, and tucks it back in her bodice. You might call it sentimental. She would call it survival. Because in a world where disease could carry you off in days, where life was as unpredictable as the weather, holding a piece of someone you loved was a way to anchor yourself. But it wasn't just friends exchanging hair. Lovers did it too, sometimes secretly, sometimes boldly. Men would keep a lover's hair tucked inside watch cases or woven into rings. A single dark curl pressed into a tiny envelope could speak volumes. Volumes that polite society would never dare read aloud. And yet, not everyone was enchanted by this practice. Some Victorians thought it was morbid, an unhealthy attachment to the physical self. Others believed it was the ultimate memento. But even then, not everyone agreed on what was appropriate. Should hair be displayed openly in the home? Was it something to be worn around the neck or hidden in the drawer? Historians still argue whether the Victorians saw hair work as purely a craft or as a sacred ritual that bridged the gap between the living and the dead. You step into a small shop selling hair keepsakes. On the shelves are brooches filled with golden curls, bracelets braided from chestnut strands, and even small framed wreaths made entirely from human hair. You spot a sign offering custom orders. The shopkeeper smiles as you approach, unfazed when you ask whether the hair in that bracelet belonged to a friend or a stranger. Does it matter? She asks with a wink. You think about that for a moment. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Victorian newspapers sometimes published etiquette advice about hair gifts. How to accept them. How to wear them. Even when it was appropriate to cut your own. A woman giving a man a lock of her hair before marriage was considered a bold move, but a man giving his hair to a woman? Scandalous. Historians still argue whether these gendered rules were strictly followed or quietly broken behind parlor doors. You glance around and notice something curious. Hair isn't just being collected from the living. You overhear quiet whispers about families cutting locks from their dearly departed, carefully preserving them in albums or jewelry. The line between love and loss blurs here. But that's a story you'll unravel soon enough. For now, you keep walking, weaving through this world where collecting hair isn't just a pastime. It's a deeply personal language, one that speaks of memory, of defiance, of connection. And you realize you just brushed past a chapter of history that's tangled, delicate, and still holding on. You move through the gentle hush of the drawing rooms, past the faint ticking of clocks and the rustle of lace. And now you settle beside a woman, carefully opening a small leather-bound diary. Nestled between the pages is a single, glistening strand of hair, tied with a ribbon no thicker than a blade of grass. You watch as she traces it with her fingertip, her face softening in memory. This isn't just a keepsake. It's a living thread to someone she cherishes. You begin to understand that in the Victorian world, a lock of hair carried an emotional gravity that perhaps you've never quite experienced. It's more than memorabilia. It's the echo of love and loss braided into one. You might assume that collecting hair was limited to a formal exchange, but no. Sometimes a friend would quietly snip a lock while another dozed nearby. Other times, strands were pulled from hairbrushes, gathered lovingly, almost ritualistically. There's a tender desperation in it, a need to hold on, even to what slips away unnoticed. Victorians didn't just collect hair from the living. They collected it from the dead, and they collected it from friends who had simply moved away across oceans or across town. In an era before text messages or late-night phone calls, a lock of hair was the most tangible way to say, "You are still with me." Historians still argue whether hair, collecting truly symbolized friendship above all, or whether it morphed quietly into a way of controlling memory, a subtle power over the image and presence of another. Was it love? Was it possession? Some argue that the line was delightfully blurred. You trail your hand along a wooden cabinet where the keepsakes are arranged with reverence. Each one holds a story. Here's a small glass vial containing the fine, almost white hair of a beloved friend lost to fever. There's a bundle tied with green thread, symbolizing hope, that belonged to a childhood companion who sailed away, never to return. And there, a hair ring, woven so tightly you can't even see where it begins or ends. Hair, in the Victorian world, became the universal souvenir. It crossed class lines. Aristocratic ladies traded it, but so did shopgirls and servants. And it wasn't just the ladies. Men, too, kept hair tokens, though they often hid them away in pockets or tucked discreetly behind watch faces. The practice stretched across Europe, dipped into America, and touched colonial outposts. A lock of hair could ride across oceans in creased letters, surviving journeys that people themselves often didn't. The sentimental weight of hair seemed to grow stronger when distance was involved. Friends moving away, lovers parting, families separated by wars or migrations. They all relied on this fragile connection. You couldn't exactly carry someone's hand across the sea, but you could carry a curl from their head, braided and pressed between pages. But here's the thing. The meaning of these hair tokens wasn't always transparent to outsiders. The same lock of hair could mean friendship, romance, or grief, depending on the color of the ribbon, the number of twists in the braid, or the way it was folded. There were unspoken rules, a language Victorians fluently understood but rarely wrote down. You realize you're wandering through a society where hair speaks louder than words. And sometimes, it wasn't all tender exchanges and warm farewells. There's a curious letter you overhear, someone reading, a woman, scorned, returning a locket containing a man's hair, snapping it shut with deliberate finality. In Victorian times, returning a hair token was the equivalent of unfriending someone on every possible platform, slamming doors they couldn't reopen. You brush past a woman meticulously sewing a thin braid into the lining of her travel bag. Hair hidden in secret compartments, sewn into hems, even stitched beneath glove linings. It's like carrying the weight of someone's presence as a private talisman. Sometimes these tokens were shared with clear intent. Other times, they were slipped away quietly, never mentioned, but fiercely treasured. Historians still argue whether the emotional layers in these exchanges were universally understood or whether some meanings have simply been lost to us. Did every color-coded ribbon truly have a shared significance? Or were there deeply personal codes known only to the giver and the receiver? The debate lingers, much like the faint scent of lavender in these parlors. As you linger by a window, watching fog drift across the streets, you realize something else. Hair collection also became a coping mechanism. Victorians faced death constantly. Epidemics, accidents, and childbirth swept people away swiftly. The response wasn't to look away from grief, but to hold onto it, sometimes literally. Hair, unlike flesh or bone, didn't decay quickly. It became a way to preserve life's echo, to soften the ache of absence. You catch fragments of stories. A brother carrying his sister's braid after she succumbed to consumption. A woman wearing a locket from her dearest friend who emigrated to America, never to return. Each story wraps tighter around you, like the braids themselves. You find yourself touching the edge of a finely worked brooch and wondering, whose story did this once hold? Was it love, friendship, loss, or maybe all three tangled together? Oh, and here's a quirky little detail you almost miss. Some women collected hair from celebrities. Yes, even back then. It wasn't uncommon to keep a clipped strand from a favorite poet, a famed actress, or even royalty, tucked among personal collections. Some women would attend public readings or appearances, hoping to snag a stray hair fallen from a bonnet or a comb. You can't help but chuckle. Paparazzi were still a century away, but fan culture was already alive and snipping. So here you are, wandering through these friendships, these subtle declarations of loyalty and love, all woven into something as delicate as a strand of hair. And in this world, even the smallest token can carry the weight of a lifetime. You drift now into the warm bustle of a Victorian parlor, where the clinking of teacups mingles with the soft hum of conversation, and you find yourself seated beside a circle of women with nimble fingers and intense focus. They're not just chatting, they're working. In their hands, hair isn't a relic to simply store. It's a material to be crafted, braided, coiled, and transformed into art. Welcome to the hair work boom, where collecting hair spiraled beyond tokens and into an entire craft movement. You watch as one woman gently moistens a fine strand of golden hair, weaving it around a metal rod, forming perfectly uniform curls that she'll later arrange into a delicate floral pattern. Her friend is braiding 3 shades of brown hair into an intricate loop, which she'll soon mount into a brooch. You'd think this was jewelry making with gold and gemstones. But no, these women are weaving memory itself. The entire parlor smells faintly of beeswax and rosewater, the quiet determination almost hypnotic. And it wasn't just a hobby. Hair work became an entire cottage industry. Some women practiced at home. Others sent their precious locks to professional hair workers. You can almost picture the workshops, light filtering through tall windows, fine combs, and curling irons spread across polished tables. Finished wreaths proudly displayed on the walls. Historians still argue whether these crafts were primarily seen as respectable home arts or whether they carried an undercurrent of rebellion. Women carving out their own skilled trade in a world that rarely valued their work outside the home. The quirky detail that makes you grin? Some mail-order catalogs back then didn't just sell fabrics or bonnets. They offered hairwork patterns. You could choose from floral wreaths, geometric bracelets, or even entire hair dioramas, complete with instructions on how to assemble your own masterpiece from the comfort of your parlor. Imagine flipping through a 19th century Etsy, deciding whether you wanted a forget-me-not brooch or a morning glory hair ring. The Victorians? Oh, they were crafty in every sense. But crafting with hair wasn't easy. It required patience, precision, and, honestly, pretty steady nerves. Hair is slippery, delicate, and maddeningly disobedient. You have to soak it to make it pliable, curl it carefully to prevent frizz, and loop it just so to maintain perfect tension. Victorians had entire toolkits for hair work. Tiny crochet hooks, special wire frames, custom-made braid presses. You watch one woman as she leans in close, her brow furrowed, looping a nearly invisible thread to bind the hair into perfect symmetry. It's more than craft, it's quiet devotion. Yet even within these meticulous circles, debates swirled. Should hair be preserved in its natural color, or was dyeing it acceptable to match the design? Should hair from the deceased be used alongside the living, or should memorial pieces remain separate? Historians still argue whether these distinctions were rigidly maintained or flexed according to personal sentiment. You pause to admire a wreath, a grand circular piece made entirely of woven hair flowers, each petal curling just right, each color representing a different friend or family member. Some wreaths grew enormous over the years, expanding with each new addition until they framed entire mantelpieces. You can't help but wonder if, when visitors admired such wreaths, they realized they were gazing at a tapestry of human connection, woven literally from the people who mattered most. And there's something else. These parlor gatherings weren't always exclusive to upper-class women. Middle-class and working-class women found their way into hairwork circles too. It became a democratic craft, accessible, personal, and deeply meaningful regardless of one's social standing. It wasn't about wealth, it was about memory. You catch the glint of a small brooch being passed around. It's made from tightly woven chestnut hair, with a miniature painted eye at its center. Morning jewelry? Maybe. A token of love? Possibly. You'll soon realize that many hairwork pieces blurred these lines, carrying layered meanings, worn proudly on lapels and pinned close to hearts. And then you stumble upon something curious, a secret tucked into a wooden box. It's a friendship album, its pages adorned with hand-cut paper flowers, pressed violets, and, most intriguingly, small, delicate curls carefully glued beside each friend's handwritten note. These albums were part memory books, part art projects, and part silent agreements. You read a note from Lucy's head that I may remember her always. It's sweet, it's a little eerie, and it's entirely sincere. You'd think with all this effort, the Victorians might have worried about hygiene, but funny enough, they didn't. Cleanliness wasn't the priority here, preservation was. Hair was boiled, soaked, and curled, but the natural oils in the story they carried, those stayed. It wasn't until much later, as germ theory gained traction, that people began side-eyeing hair work with mild horror. For now, in these parlors, hair was pure, almost sacred. Historians still argue whether hairwork's popularity was driven by genuine affection or subtly influenced by emerging consumer markets, pushing the craft into homes through patterned books and workshops. Was this a grassroots tradition, or was it cleverly nudged along by savvy businesswomen and merchants? Like a half-finished braid, the answer remains delightfully tangled. You linger by the fireplace, watching as another woman carefully seals a braid into a glass locket. She presses her thumb to the cool surface, a faint smile playing at her lips. She's not making something for sale, nor for public display. She's crafting a private memory, stitched into something solid, something lasting. The rise of hair work, you realize, wasn't just about sentiment. It was about permanence in a world where so much was fleeting. A world where people, especially women, weren't often allowed to leave visible marks behind. But here they did. One loop, one curl, one braid at a time. You trail along velvet-lined hallways now, the air thick with the soft weight of oil lamps and the faint scent of polished wood, until you find yourself among a different kind of hair collector, the ones who made it their livelihood. You see, not everyone in the Victorian era had the patience, skill, or even the inclination to braid hair into flowers by hand at home. Sometimes they turned to the professionals, and this, my friend, is where the hairwork industry quietly exploded. In front of you stands the unassuming shop front of a hair artist. The sign above the door is modest, hand-painted, but once you step inside, you're surrounded by delicate glass domes housing hair wreaths, brooches, and bracelets that shimmer under the lamplight. The woman behind the counter greets you without surprise, as though she already knows why you've come. Whether you bring the hair of a best friend moving to Australia, a suitor's auburn curl, or the final strand from a beloved mother's brush, she knows exactly what to do. Victorian hairworkers didn't just craft, they advertised. Some shops proudly displayed sample boards showcasing different braid styles, floral arrangements, and ring patterns, much like a modern-day jewelry catalog. You could browse the options, select your design, and the artist would skillfully transform your supplied lock into a custom piece. There were even entire companies that specialized in mail-order hairwork. Imagine carefully wrapping a precious bundle of hair, sending it off by post, and waiting for weeks for it to return as a brooch, a watch chain, or a framed wreath. You hope, of course, that the right hair comes back. And yes, that was a gamble. The quirky thing? Sometimes hair workers cut corners. If a customer didn't send enough hair, or if the strands were too short, they'd quietly substitute with generic hair from their stock. Blonde for blonde, brown for brown. Would you really notice? Maybe not. You chuckle, realizing that in some cases, people wore hair work believing it held a deeply personal connection, when in fact it might have included bits of a stranger's locks. Historians still argue whether this was an occasional mishap or a widely accepted industry secret. Was it a small deceit or an open secret everyone chose to ignore? You overhear a woman discussing pricing. Hair work wasn't cheap. The more intricate the braid, the higher the cost. The larger the wreath, the more you paid. And if you wanted to commission a complex multicolor piece, perhaps combining the hair of several friends or family members into one grand design, that could cost you dearly, both in shillings and in patience. Some women saved for months, even years, to afford a particular piece. You pause to admire one of the most striking items, a gentleman's watch chain braided from hair. Men, though more discreet, often participated in this tradition. They wore hair work as mourning symbols, as love tokens, or simply as personal mementos tucked beneath their waistcoats. A gentleman might pass a braided chain between his fingers while waiting for a train, each touch grounding him in the memory of the friend who gifted it. Quiet, subtle, deeply personal. As you wander through the workshop, you notice something else: the hairworker's tools. Tiny crochet hooks for looping hair into delicate patterns, heated curling tongs to shape the strands, miniature tweezers to pull the finest threads into place. The level of precision is staggering. You watch as a young apprentice spends nearly an hour perfecting the curl of a single petal in a hair flower. One sneeze and the entire arrangement could unravel. No pressure, though. It wasn't always somber work. Some customers requested hair pieces to celebrate friendships, while everyone was still very much alive. There were friendship rings, bracelets, even decorative frames featuring the hair of living friends in cheerful, sunny designs. Historians still argue whether these living hair pieces were viewed with the same emotional depth as mourning jewelry, or whether they occupied a lighter, more fashionable space in Victorian society. You overhear another curious practice. Some shops offered hair matching services. Let's say you wanted a multi-strand bracelet, but you didn't have enough hair from your friend. The shop might offer to blend in similar hair from their stock to complete the design. In a world without DNA testing, who would ever know? And honestly, would it really matter? You smile to yourself. The Victorians were many things, but they were certainly practical. You lean over a counter where the hair worker is assembling a floral wreath, a masterpiece of patience and symbolism. Each flower carries a meaning. Ivy for fidelity, forget-me-nots for remembrance, roses for love, lilies for purity. The language of flowers, combined with the permanence of hair, created layers of meaning that only the closest friends would fully understand. Sometimes, hair was shaped into intricate curls to mimic leaves and stems, blending seamlessly with the flowers. Other times, the hair itself became the flower, each petal meticulously looped and bound. Oh, and here's a delightfully odd tidbit. Some ambitious hair workers didn't stop at jewelry or wreaths. They created entire hairwork landscapes, trees, cottages, even birds. all made entirely of human hair. Imagine visiting someone's home and finding a delicate scene under glass. Perhaps a weeping willow made from a mother's silver strands, standing beside a riverbank of braided brown locks from childhood friends. These weren't just decorations. They were narrative shrines, encapsulating entire life stories in a web of hair. You can't help but think about the trust people placed in these hair workers. Mailing a lock of hair, essentially a piece of a person's identity, to a stranger with a hope that it would return as something beautiful and meaningful. The Victorians accepted this vulnerability, perhaps because they lived with the constant shadow of loss. They understood that even the most fragile things needed preserving. Historians still argue whether the emotional weight people assign to these objects remains fully understandable to us today, or whether modern distance has rendered the tradition simply odd, perhaps even macabre. Do we really grasp what it meant to wear a bracelet braided from a friend's hair as you walk through a city where cholera lurked in the water and war was always a distant thunder? Maybe not. But as you run your fingers along the delicate braids displayed in the shop, you sense the pulse of something that transcends time, an ache to hold onto what might otherwise slip away. The bell above the door jingles softly as another customer enters, carefully cradling a folded piece of cloth. You know without looking that inside is another lock of hair, another story waiting to be woven. You drift further, leaving behind the polite chatter of parlors and the quiet hum of hairwork shops, until you step into the private, sometimes shadowy corners of Victorian life, where hair collection wasn't always about friendship, or even about love. Sometimes it teetered into obsession. In your hands now, you find a small, leather-bound journal. Tucked between its pages, pressed flat and carefully labeled, are locks of hair collected not with permission, but in secret. Yes, some Victorians quietly snipped strands from the unaware, sometimes as trophies, sometimes as strange tokens of unspoken affection. You can almost picture it. A gentleman, seated just behind a lady at the theater, stealthily clipping a wisp of her hair as a keepsake, or a servant, idolizing the young master of the house, slipping a curl from a comb left on the dressing table. The quirky twist? There were even documented cases of famous people having their hair stolen by admirers. Snipping a celebrity's lock was the Victorian version of scoring a selfie, except considerably creepier and, highly illegal if you got caught. Hair wasn't just sentimental, it was power. It was possession. Historians still argue whether this crossed into stalking territory or whether it was merely viewed as the peculiar enthusiasm of the time. You wander through a cluttered study where a collector has proudly arranged dozens of tiny glass vials, each containing a single curl. Some labeled, some not. It's both fascinating and unsettling, isn't it? You pause, staring at a label. Miss Emily, May 1864. No other details. Who was Emily? Did she know a piece of herself was quietly filed away in this dusty cabinet? The Victorians had a complicated relationship with privacy, and hair, so intimate, so tangible, blurred those boundaries. But it wasn't just individuals who became targets. The hair of political figures, royalty, and even executed criminals was eagerly sought after. You find yourself standing before a glass display in a curiosity shop, peering at a carefully framed lock said to belong to none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. Whether it's genuine or not, well, historians still argue about that. These prized strands were traded, auctioned, and revered like relics. A single lock could change hands for significant sums, especially if the owner was famous or infamous. You hear the whisper of an even stranger practice: competitive hair collecting. Victorian scrapbooks sometimes included locks from as many notable people as possible, almost like collecting baseball cards today. There were documented cases of people boasting about how many specimens they'd gathered. You half expect someone to pop up with a lock of Charles Dickens and a smug grin, like they've just won some bizarre social game. But here's where things get especially tangled. Some collectors crossed a moral line, hunting hair from the recently deceased. Newspapers occasionally reported on the theft of hair from fresh graves or from funeral homes. Picture the scandal: mourning families discovering that someone had clipped a treasured curl not to remember, but to hoard. Were these isolated crimes, or was there a darker subculture? Historians still argue whether grave robbing for hair was widespread or simply sensationalized by the press. Either way, you can't help but shiver. And yet, even among these secret collectors, there was an odd reverence. They didn't just toss these hair clippings into drawers. They arranged them carefully in albums, labeled them with dates, sometimes adding pressed flowers or drawings. It wasn't necessarily malicious. It was, in its own bizarre way, an attempt to preserve the essence of people they admired, loved, or envied. Sometimes you wonder if the line between love and possession was thinner than a single hair. The most curious thing? Victorians didn't find this nearly as disturbing as you probably do now. Hair was seen as an acceptable relic to collect, a link to someone's spirit or presence. In fact, some people went out of their way to gift hair to admirers, either as a gesture of affection or as a public token, like politicians sending locks to supporters. Imagine if your favorite celebrity today mailed you a little bundle of their hair, tied with a silk ribbon. You'd probably scream or call security. You step into a dusty auction house where a small crowd gathers around a velvet-lined box containing a curled lock labeled Lord Byron, 1824. Bidding escalates quickly. There's tension in the air. Some bidders likely doubt the authenticity, but that doesn't seem to matter. The story is what sells. You watch as the hammer falls. The buyer carefully lifts the glass case, and the lock is tucked away with great satisfaction. It's no longer about whether the hair is real. It's about owning a piece of legend. And hair wasn't always collected from the living or the dead. Sometimes it was scavenged from other objects. People would cut hair from clothing, from abandoned brushes, or from combs left in public spaces. Some even gathered stray hairs from furniture or theater seats. Though, let's be honest, that's a level of dedication most people today would find wildly unsettling. Historians still argue whether these secretive practices should be seen as part of the broader hairwear tradition or whether they belong in their own separate, shadowy category. Were they simply extreme fans, or were they early examples of a collector's compulsion gone rogue? You shift uneasily as you realize that hair, so easily overlooked today, held immense social weight. To possess someone's hair, especially without their knowledge, was to hold a part of them in your hands. A part that didn't rot, that didn't decay, that lingered long after the person was gone. It was tangible memory, yes, but also control. Maybe that's what drew people to it. The irresistible temptation to hold on to something or someone forever. And so you wander away from these private hoards and secret journals. The quiet obsession still trailing behind you like the faintest wisp of perfume in the air. Hair, it seems, has always been more than just hair. Its connection, its desire, its memory, and sometimes it's something much stranger. You follow the winding streetlights now, their golden pools of light flickering over cobblestones slick with evening mist, and you stumble into yet another layer of the Victorian hair story, the grand public displays. Yes, collecting hair wasn't always a private affair, kept to lockets and hidden journals. Sometimes, Victorians put these hair creations front and center, proudly exhibiting them for all to see. And some of these displays, they were spectacularly, gloriously over the top. You shuffle into a crowded exhibition hall, the scent of damp coats and burning gas lamps mingling as people press forward to gawk at the showcase of the day. Enormous hair wreaths, some as wide as carriage wheels, framed in dark wood and hung like sacred relics on the walls. You're almost knocked backward by the sheer scale of them. Twisting vines, blooming hair flowers, carefully plaited names woven through the branches. Each one tells a story of friendship, of family, of entire social circles immortalized in braided strands. You lean closer to a small brass plaque and realize this isn't the hair of just one person. It's a community wreath built from the hair of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals, friends, neighbors, church congregants. Think of it as the Victorian version of a yearbook, except instead of signatures, people contributed snippets of themselves. The quirky thing? In some towns, these wreaths hung in public spaces, schools, churches, even town halls. A constant, visual reminder of the ties that bound people together. Historians still argue whether these public displays were meant to be genuine communal tokens or whether they doubled as quiet status symbols. Who got included? Whose hair was featured at the center? Whose name was elegantly braided into the most visible spot? Victorian social hierarchies were rarely left to chance. You chuckle, realizing that in a way, it's not so different from social media cliques today. People curating who appears in their feed, who gets tagged, who's front and center. Back then, it just happened to involve, well, human hair. But some exhibitions were grander still. You step into the Great Exhibition of 1851, a dazzling wonderland of Victorian ingenuity. Somewhere between the enormous crystal fountains and the shiny new steam engines, you find a delicate, nearly forgotten booth dedicated to the art of hair work. Here, you marvel at pieces that push the limits of patience and precision. Hair wreaths shaped like royal crests, hair portraits painstakingly assembled strand by strand, hair sculptures so intricate that you have to lean in to believe they're not painted. And just when you think you've seen everything, you find the piece de resistance, a life-sized landscape scene under glass, with trees, flowers, and even tiny cottages all crafted from human hair. You probably won't survive this, but yes, someone actually sat for years curling and wiring each little leaf and branch into place. The patience. You shake your head in awe, and maybe a little bit of terror. The artists themselves often gave live demonstrations at these exhibitions, looping strands with impossibly tiny hooks while crowds murmured in amazement. People could purchase kits to try their hand at home, complete with instructions, wire frames, and, if needed, a sample supply of hair in case you didn't have enough from your own friends. Hair work, it seemed, had become not just a sentimental craft, but a public art form. There's something quietly fascinating about how Victorians blurred the line between public and private. What began as deeply personal mementos, hair lockets tucked near the heart, expanded into elaborate public spectacles. Some families even hung massive hair wreaths in their front parlors, right where guests would see them upon entering the house. Imagine walking into someone's living room, and the first thing you see is an enormous hair sculpture glinting in the sunlight. Oh, no pressure, just 1,000 intertwined life stories dangling in plain view. But public hair displays weren't only about celebration. They were often used in mourning as well. Community wreaths sometimes memorialized groups lost in epidemics or wars. You notice one wreath labeled with dates from a particularly brutal cholera outbreak. Each curl, each braid, represents someone who didn't survive. These pieces carried collective grief, woven together strand by strand. Historians still argue whether these communal mourning pieces truly provided comfort or whether they quietly reinforced the fear that death was always just around the corner. The Victorians didn't shy away from reminders of mortality. Quite the opposite. They folded death into the fabric of daily life. Hair wreaths, in their own peculiar way, became part of that ritual, bridging memory and presence, absence and visibility. And speaking of visibility, you overhear excited chatter about another bizarre trend: competitive hair art societies. Yes, people formed clubs specifically to create and display hair work. They hosted competitions, awarded ribbons, and published newsletters filled with tips and success stories. Some women proudly wrote in to share that they had finally completed a complex 7-strand braid, while others detailed how they had collected hair from multiple generations to craft a family history in braids and flowers. The quirky bit? There were even disagreements over technique. Whether to boil hair to make it more pliable, whether to use glue or wax to hold complex shapes, whether to mix different shades for aesthetic balance, or to preserve the purity of each person's hair color. It's comforting, in a way, to know that even in the world of hair work, people found room for polite bickering. As you weave through the exhibition, you stumble upon a slightly frayed pamphlet advertising hair weaving workshops for ladies of all skill levels. You imagine these as the Victorian version of a modern paint and sip night, except with a lot more braiding and probably fewer giggles. Or maybe not. After all, women gathered in circles, chatting, laughing, and working with their hands, creating these intricate pieces while sharing stories about the people whose hair they stitched into immortality. And here's a tender thought. Many of these hair wreaths and jewelry pieces survive for generations, lovingly passed down, carefully dusted, sometimes even reframed. But over time, as taste changed, they drifted into attics, secondhand shops, and antique stores. Now, you find them in curiosity cabinets, their origins forgotten, the names once so carefully braided, now unknown to the strangers who admire them. You brush your fingertips along the glass of one such wreath, marveling at the soft, looped petals, wondering whose stories lie within these silent strands. The world that created them has long since faded, but the hair remains unchanged, patient, waiting. You ease away from the grand exhibition halls now, slipping back into smaller, quieter rooms where the air hums with the soft clicking of wire tools and the faint, sweet tang of glue. The story leads you here, to the homes where Victorian women took hair work into their own hands, literally. And this is where the craft became most intimate, most personal. You tiptoe through a modest parlor, where a woman sits hunched over her lap desk, her fingers deftly looping a fine strand of chestnut hair around a delicate metal frame. It's not for profit. It's not for display. This is her sister's hair, recently passed, and the wreath she's building is for herself, for her memory, for quiet mourning. You probably won't survive this, but she's using her own tears as moisture to soften the strands. It's both heartbreaking and oddly poetic, isn't it? In homes across Victorian England and America, Hairwork became a cherished domestic art. It wasn't something you necessarily hired out to professionals, although some did, but a skill many women learned and taught to one another. Hairwork manuals, with charmingly specific instructions and detailed diagrams, became household staples. How to boil the hair for maximum flexibility was right there alongside recipes for plum pudding. You spot one such manual, its cover frayed from years of thumbing. The quirky bit? Some of these guides assumed that women would simply have large stashes of hair lying around, either from friends or family, or that they would, casually keep their own hair in a drawer as it shed over time. And many did. Victorian households often had little boxes or pouches for collecting fallen strands. Combing out your hair in the morning wasn't just a chore. It was a quiet harvesting. The hair saved today might one day find its way into a bracelet, a brooch, or a family wreath. Historians still argue whether this widespread, casual collecting of hair was a form of silent preparation for loss, or whether it simply reflected the frugal, nothing goes to waste mindset of the time. After all, they repurposed everything from fabric scraps to candle stubs, so why not hair? You glance over a family sitting together on a rainy afternoon, each person contributing to a growing wreath. Mother weaving the central flowers, daughters braiding stems, a son carefully twisting loops of his late father's dark hair. It's a communal act, intimate yet strangely practical. Hair, unlike photographs, could be touched, braided, worn. It didn't fade. It didn't yellow with age. It lasted. And here's a tender twist. Some Victorian women mixed hair from the living with hair of the deceased in the same piece, symbolizing the unbroken chain of love and family. You marvel at this. Grief and joy, life and death, all entwined in a single bloom of hair. The process was intricate, sometimes painfully so. Fine wire was used to shape loops, tiny glass beads were added for dewdrops, and it could take weeks, months, even to complete a single wreath. Imagine sitting with that, day after day, shaping and twisting the physical remnants of your loved ones into lasting art. It was perhaps a slow-moving therapy, one that Victorian society quietly encouraged, especially for women. And let's not forget the less somber uses. In the flutter of friendship and courtship, women wove hair into gifts. Small rings, watch chains, elaborate brooches. You walk past the desk where a young woman giggles as she knots her own hair into a tiny heart and tucks it inside a folded love letter. This wasn't morbid, it was romantic. To give a lock of hair was to give a piece of yourself, quite literally. Of course, hairwork wasn't always easy. Some women found the task frustrating, their fingers cramping over the thin wires, the hair slipping free just as the perfect loop took shape. Manuals sternly warned, patience is essential. And sometimes, that patience was tested by an unpleasant surprise, like finding your work marred by split ends or brittle hair that snapped mid-braid. Oh, the horror. You linger near a shelf where small vials sit in neat rows, each containing a curl labeled by name. Some are light, some dark, some gray with age. This was the quiet archive, the waiting room for future projects. Not every lock immediately became a piece of jewelry or art. Some waited years, decades before their turn arrived. The quirky bit? There were even debates in hairwork manuals about whether to wash the hair first. Some insisted that the natural oils helped the strands hold shape better. Others argued that cleanliness was essential, lest the finished product attract moths, or worse. Can you imagine painstakingly crafting a hair wreath only to discover it's been nibbled by tiny insects? That's a level of devastation you don't come back from quickly. Historians still argue whether the popularity of hair work was driven more by genuine emotional need or by the social pressures of the era. Was it truly about memory, or was it another carefully performed step in the complex Victorian dance of etiquette and appearances? You pass a small sewing basket where stray strands have been gathered, not yet assigned to a project, just waiting. Waiting for a decision, for a purpose, for someone to remember. You realize that to the Victorians, hair was the perfect keepsake. It captured life, it endured, it was inherently personal, and yet it could be transformed into something astonishingly beautiful. You pause to admire a finished wreath hanging in a modest frame. It's not grand. It's not for public show. But the names carefully inked below the flowers, Mother, Father, Clara, James, speak volumes. This was memory made tangible, love woven into loops and braids. It's quiet, it's tender, and it lingers much like the faint scent of lavender still clinging to the room. You step back, feeling the soft weight of the centuries pressing gently on your shoulders. The story isn't about hair, not really. It's about connection, about the lengths people will go to remember, about how sometimes what we leave behind isn't just the stories. We leave behind pieces of ourselves, waiting to be touched, braided, held. You find yourself now drifting toward the quiet attics, the antique shops, the forgotten drawers where these delicate hairworks have finally come to rest. Dust motes float like golden confetti in the afternoon light as you carefully crack open a worn wooden box. Inside, there's a hair brooch, its glass cover faintly scratched, its woven design still remarkably intact, a tiny loop of blonde curls suspended forever. And as you turn it in your fingers, you realize it's unmarked. No names, no dates, no hint of whose hair this once was. The story it carried, the love, the grief, the friendship, it's all evaporated, like the faint scent of lavender that once lingered but now has faded into memory's attic. You probably won't survive this realization, but it's a little like stumbling across an abandoned social media account with no password. Still there, still visible, but silent, sealed off. Many hairworks met this quiet fate. As Victorian tastes shifted and the world sped into the 20th century, hair jewelry and wreaths began to feel outdated, even macabre. Families tucked them away or quietly discarded them, and the meanings woven into their strands became puzzles no one could solve. Today, they sometimes surface in antique markets, charming oddities with unknown origins, beautiful but untethered. The quirky thing? Some modern collectors adore these pieces precisely because their stories have been lost. They become blank canvases for the imagination. Whose hair is this? Was it a mother's, a lover's, a friend's? Were they cherished? Were they missed? The uncertainty is part of the charm, a lingering whisper of someone's vanished world. Historians still argue whether the modern fascination with hair work is an earnest attempt to reconnect with the past, or just another round of aesthetic trend chasing. Are we genuinely moved by the craft, or simply intrigued by the strangeness? You can't help but wonder as you cradle the brooch in your palm, feeling the faint chill of the glass against your skin. But not all hair collections have vanished into dusty corners. You wander into a modern museum, where some of these relics are now carefully preserved, cataloged, and displayed under soft lights. Labels provide what little information survives, a date, perhaps, or a known family name. But many pieces are simply marked as unknown. And in a strange twist, hair art is making a quiet comeback. Some contemporary artists have revived the practice, weaving human hair into jewelry, sculptures, even performance pieces. You smirk, imagining a modern workshop where participants sip oat milk lattes while carefully braiding strands into friendship tokens, unaware that they're stepping directly into Victorian footprints. The conversation around hair work has also shifted. Today, it often sparks debates about body autonomy, about how much of ourselves we're willing to share, about whether hair still holds power as a token of intimacy. After all, we shed it constantly. We dye it, we cut it, we style it. And yet we're still weirdly attached to it as something deeply personal. You step into a cozy corner of the museum where an exhibit invites visitors to contribute a lock of their own hair to a growing community wreath. You run your fingers over your scalp, pondering whether you would give up a piece of yourself to this silent archive. The Victorians did it without hesitation. For them, hair was both a gift and a legacy. And maybe, just maybe, that's why hair work lingers. Not because of the morbidity, not because of the craftsmanship, but because of its stubborn endurance. Hair outlasts photographs, outlasts letters. It carries DNA. It persists. You walk past a glass case housing a small, perfect hair ring. It's weaved so tight you can barely see the individual strands. The label reads simply, Lover's Gift, circa 1870. No names, no sender, no recipient. Just a fragment of someone's love story, still circling quietly in time. You realize that you've been tracing this soft, looping path all night, through lockets, wreaths, public displays, private collections, forgotten boxes, and it all comes back to this simple truth. Humans are desperate to hold on, to remember, to leave something behind that will speak for them when they're gone. And here's the quirky, ironic bit. You're part of this story now. You, sitting here, listening, weaving the strands of this history into your own quiet memory. You probably didn't plan to care about Victorian hair collections tonight, but here you are, cradling their weight in your imagination. Somewhere out there, a dusty wreath waits in a shop window. Somewhere, a brooch lies in a drawer, its story fading. And somewhere, perhaps, someone gently braids a lock of hair into a token of friendship, just as they did 2 centuries ago. And as you drift through this final room, you begin to notice something. The way the afternoon light softens, the way the hush settles in like a gentle hand on your shoulder. The story winds down, not with a sharp full stop, but with a lingering, tender pause. Wind down 300 words. Your footsteps grow slower now, softer, as though the floor beneath you has turned to something warm and yielding. The dust no longer stirs. The glass cases stand in quiet ranks, their contents resting as if they've always belonged to the hush. You let your breathing slow, allowing the gentle rhythm of this long-forgotten world to cradle you. The braided hair, the delicate loops, the names that have melted into time. They're all still here, waiting, holding steady in their tiny, perfect shapes. The hands that once gathered, combed, and wove have long since faded, but their care lingers in every twisted strand. You trail your fingers lightly along the edge of the nearest frame, barely touching, as if afraid to disturb the fragile threads of memory. The story isn't loud now. It has softened, become a quiet pulse beneath your skin, a gentle breath against your ear. Let the soft hum of the night settle around you, like the low drone of distant bees, the whisper of old lace brushing against wood. There's no rush. There's nowhere else you need to be. Just this moment, just this tender, looping path that curls back upon itself, like a braid, like a wreath, like a story that never truly ends. And as you let your eyes grow heavy, as you allow the day's edges to blur, remember, what we hold on to says as much about us as what we let go. Somewhere, a strand of hair still waits, still holds its shape, still carries the weight of someone's love. Sweet dreams.